This is Invested in Climate with Jason Rissman. I see climate as the world's biggest, most diverse, most important movement in human history. Millions of people dedicate themselves every day to protecting the planet. This podcast shares conversations with advocates, entrepreneurs, investors, policy experts, and anyone else that can push our thinking about what's possible and what needs to happen to address climate change. If you have ideas for episodes or feedback, get in touch on LinkedIn. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. I'm currently building a new venture. It's related to storytelling and how we engage all sorts of folks in meaningful climate action. If you have expertise in this area, big ideas, or examples of something that's really working, get in touch. Thanks for listening and for doing whatever it is you're doing to support climate progress. Okay, let's get started.
Just look at the Climate 1.0 movement. The only success stories, First Solar, Tesla, QuantumScape, Sunrun, arguably, SunEdison at the time, all of them accessed government programs to survive. Elon then talked about the fact that the DOE loan program saved Tesla's business. History has since scrubbed those references, but it is just incontrovertibly true that to hit huge volumes of manufacturing scale in a very short period of time, the market alone will not suffice. Even if your techno-economics are solved at scale, you're going to need some help to ramp.
Hi, folks. Every once in a while, I come across an investment firm with a really different edge and perspective. Overture VC is one such firm. Their specialty is policy, not just understanding the unique opportunities climate tech companies have with government incentives and helping them navigate that tricky terrain, but also actually lobbying for policies that'll benefit those companies. In the words of Overture founder and managing partner Shomik and I, there's a $1.2 trillion wall of government money coming downhill for climate companies. So Overture's edge is meaningful and can make a big difference for a wide range of companies. Shomik and I discuss his background, how he moved into investing from politics, the opportunities recent climate policy has created for startups, examples of Overture's portfolio companies and how the firm has helped them, and much more, including what's at stake in the upcoming election. Speaking of the election, it's next week. If you don't yet have a plan for how to get your ballot in or haven't called your friends and family to make sure they're voting, now is the time. Shomik mentions a mobile app called Reach, a great tool to help you contact people you know in swing states. Lots to do, think about, and learn in this one. Enjoy. Shomik, welcome to Invest in Climate. So great to have you here today.
Jason, great to be with you. Thanks for having me, man.
Where are you dialing in from?
Los Angeles.
All right. Well, almost crossed paths with you in New York during Climate Week and spending more time in LA these days. So hopefully see you soon. Let's dive in by hearing a bit about you. Looking at your background, it looks like you've had a foot in politics and a foot in finance for a long time. It's kind of a rare mix, but perfectly fitting for what you're doing over there at Overture. We'll get into Overture in a minute. First, tell us a bit about your background and the questions and sort of the aha moments that directed you over the years.
Well, I, first of all, barely qualify as a finance person. I would say that politics was my first love. And I genuinely thought and still do think that politics is a really effective way to help the most people possible. I started my career working for Barack Obama at a very young age. I was 25 years old when I joined him. I was an early campaign staffer when he was thinking about running for president for something called the Hope Fund PAC, which later became Obama for America, and had the good fortune of riding that unbelievable wave. I made some of my closest friends. I ran the Mid-Atlantic region, which had about 8 states. And that was a ride of a lifetime. That trip was some of my formative years, formative friendships. My claim to fame was helping the team outraise Hillary Clinton in 2007 in the first quarter, which was the first sort of tremor of a series of earthquakes that helped launch that unlikely candidate. After the campaign, I worked in the West Wing for a couple of years. Got to serve the president there, which was the ride of a lifetime. I thought I was the chief of staff. It turned out I was just like a special boy. And so after a couple of years of that, I left to go to business school and sort of shifted my career into climate. I was greenfielding utility scale solar projects around the world. And then in 2016, after Trump happened, I launched a venture fund to sort of help modernize the tech stack of the Democratic Party. And I wanted to find a way of uniting all these strange threads in my life, from campaigns and politics to government to climate to early stage investing. And that's what settled me on Overture. It was really just an opportunity to unite a lot of the threads in my life and unite a lot of the people in my life that I love. So my three co-founders are some of my best friends. One was a chief of staff at the Department of Energy and an early climate advisor to the president. We met in New Hampshire on the primary in 2008, 2007. Cried our eyes out in a parking lot after that loss in New Hampshire and bonded. His name's Brandon Hurlbut. He runs one of the best government affairs firms in climate called Boundary Stone. And so our model is to invest in early stage startups and to deliver Boundary Stone as a lobbying entity that can help our companies solve some of these big problems in working with government.
Well, amazing that you saw the opportunity to work with some old friends. That means a lot. And there was probably a unique opportunity that you saw in terms of how that sort of differentiated offer and capability around government and policy would create an unfair advantage for the companies you're working with. Tell us a bit about that in terms of the business case and the opportunity ultimately for your investors.
Ultimately, the climate problem is a mispriced externality, right? It is a market failure that we have to address. And as a result, I think the government is going to play this central casting role as it has in past emergencies. In World War II, the government paid bedding manufacturers to make parachutes. And similarly, we think the IRA, CHIPS bill, and infrastructure bill, which collectively have a $1.2 trillion wall of money coming downhill for climate, we think that it's just the opening salvo. We think that the government over the next couple decades will have to play an increasingly strong role as the skies turned orange from wildfires and as two hurricanes hit the same sliver path in recent weeks. And as a result, if the government's going to play a role of buyer, banker, and referee, these early stage startups need to have a government affairs strategy. If you just look at the Climate 1.0 movement, the only success stories, First Solar, Tesla, QuantumScape, Sunrun, arguably, SunEdison at the time, all of them accessed government programs to survive. Elon then talked about the fact that the DOE loan program saved Tesla's business. History has since scrubbed those references, but it is just incontrovertibly true that to hit huge volumes of manufacturing scale in a very short period of time, the market alone will not suffice. Even if your techno-economics are solved at scale, you're going to need some help to ramp. If you just look at like a plastics factory, Shell recently opened a multi-billion-dollar plastics factory in the South and earned billions of dollars in incentives to do so, heavily subsidized by state and federal government incentives, and is producing plastics at something like $1 a pound of plastic. How are you going to ask competitors to build scalable solutions in a 20-year period to catch that ramp? It is going to require the government to step in and help. And so while at scale, I fully believe that techno-economics have to be solved, Overture exists to be a bridge to help these early companies scale with lightning speed in order to make a difference for our net zero commitments. And I think the government needs to be a central partner in that, though I also equally believe that market forces must be solved at scale in order to have true success. Our model is to sort of bend the capital intensity of some of the hardware companies we invest in, solve the valley of death we're seeing between the A's and B's by loading these companies up with tax credits, with non-dilutive capital, with low-cost loans, with the rules that will be shaped to help their long-term success. And then in our own underwriting when investing, ensure that the technology can ultimately stand on its own 2 feet.
Let's talk about the most recent administration, the Biden-Harris administration, which has achieved the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act that you mentioned. Help us understand, as you are looking at the startup ecosystem, what climate tech spaces have been benefiting most from these recent policies, and what's most interesting to you as an investor?
I think we could talk largely about three sort of buckets of dynamics. Bucket one is areas where techno-economics are fully solved, where the market is actually advancing decarbonization, not because the market particularly cares about climate, but because this is simply the cheapest, fastest, best alternative in the market. So in that bucket, I would put solar, wind. We're starting to see batteries fall into that category, where at some moments of the day in some parts of the country, solar and wind are simply the cheapest forms of energy available. And so the market is adopting them so quickly that it is singeing everyone's eyebrows, right? Like solar continues to surprise everybody to the upside because we're all bad at understanding exponential growth. In those categories, I would say IRA incentives are helpful, But because technoeconomics are solved, these are looking more like infrastructure projects than they are venture investments. And as a result, we're interested in the software wrappers around these things. We're interested in market innovations, but we're not really interested in touching the hardware because those things are just moving at a pace on their own. Bucket two is areas where technoeconomics are not quite solved yet, and as a result, where some government involvement is necessary in order to help these technologies climb down a curve. I would put sustainable aviation fuel, I would put green steel and green cement in that bucket. I would put some carbon removal in that bucket that needs some 45Q or some other pathway from the government to help them climb. And then in bucket three, I would put things that have no techno-economics solved yet and don't have enough government subsidy to warrant investment yet. Unfortunately, I would put some of the adaptation risks in that bucket where you simply don't have enough government solution and the market does not know what to do with it. And it's like a kind of open sewer of problems and a sort of tragedy of the commons. You can expect in Overture's case, more software in bucket one and more hardware in bucket two. And so that's where most of our portfolio sort of matches. As an example, we're heavy investors in a company called Antora, which is a thermal battery technology. Antora will be able to beat natural gas at its own game, which is incredibly hard to do because Antora is both decarbonizing industrial heat for heavy industry and producing backup power at a blended rate that will simply beat, hopefully one day, Henry Hub natural gas prices, which are rock bottom in this country because of hydraulic fracking and a bunch of other reasons. The unlock that we were able to provide Antora was to qualify all thermal batteries for 45X, which is the uncapped tax credit at the heart of the IRA that pays OEMs to make things, much like in World War II when the US government paid bedding manufacturers to make parachutes. Antora and thermal batteries did not originally qualify for 45X, and Overture, in partnership with our great partners Boundary Stone, launched a full campaign against the White House, Department of Energy, and Department of Treasury and Senate, and got thermal batteries qualified for 45X. That singular action doubled the gross margins of companies like Antora and was actually a rising tide for all thermal battery technologies, which was very helpful. And so those are the kind of actions that we want to take in support of companies whose tipping point technoeconomics can come, but in the near term do need a little bit of help to survive.
Amazing. Well, I definitely want to hear more examples. Let's cover a few of the basics first, though. Tell us about the fund, how big it is, what stage you focus on, what's your sweet spot?
We're a $62 million fund one. We have focused on seed and series A, and we are going to get ready to launch fund two in about 6 months or so. And largely the same strategy. We'll have a couple of really exciting new personnel to announce in the near future to help on the investing team. We're looking for great founders that are building defensible technology and gigantic markets that have the kind of obsessive drive to go build in a hurry.
Shomik, let's hear a bit more about the work that you're doing that really sets Overture apart. You mentioned for one of your portfolio companies actually lobbying the Biden-Harris administration and the DOE for a new set of policies. Give us some other examples of the type of work that you do that really makes you different as an investor.
There's a couple of flavors of this. The first is understanding government programs and then accessing them in a way to be maximally helpful for a company. As an example, there's a tax credit called 48C, which is in the IRA, which is a capped tax credit, which means it's competitive. The average success rate of a climate startup applying for a 48C tax credit is 10% success rate. I'm really sort of grateful of the Boundary Stone team, our partners, who have helped 100% of Overture startups who applied for 48C qualify and win, with a median success amount of $6 million non-dilutive in 48C tax credits. As you can imagine, if you're a seed stage startup, qualifying for a $6 million non-dilutive tax credit is enormously helpful. And candidly, as an investor, it's enormously helpful to have non-dilutive capital rather than equity that is dilutive to owners. That's one sort of bucket of work. Other buckets of work that are interesting are that in some cases now Boundary Stone has been able to work with startups to insert careful language into legislation that can help entire corners of the industry be successful in different ways. And so whether you are coaching a founder on what it means, what a government program means, whether you're helping a founder access a program, whether you're helping a founder ultimately in these cases where there is an opening in the legislative Aperture, and you can insert language that can be helpful to an entire corner of an ecosystem. Those are a couple flavors. The stuff that I think we're increasingly interested in as well is political action. There are hyper-local political actions you can take to shape markets. As an example, the city of Brookline recently banned natural gas connections to new builds. It was a referendum and a ballot initiative that passed that. I'm really interested in whether you can take political action and unite different corners of political pockets and state tables and drive an action that is in service of decarbonization, but that can also build new markets. I mean, ultimately, the US government will have to create and destroy new markets in service of climate. You're going to see a carbon removal market build over time from nothing, as you are going to see certain fossil fuel markets get kicked off a curb ultimately, which they'll have to. As an example, the city of Santa Monica has set zones in which a zero emissions vehicle must be the vehicle of delivery for packages, the packages that haunt all of our homes with things we don't need all the time. How can you expand those curb zones? We're investors in a company called Harbinger, for example, which is building a mid-duty EV truck from scratch. Capricorn just led the Series B. This company is dynamic and unbelievable. Those cities in blue states should continue to insist on curb zones that must be delivered from ZEV trucks and EV trucks, right? Like that seems like such an interesting opportunity for us to continue to expand the market of opportunity while also advancing decarbonization broadly. And so those are examples of things I'm really interested in pulling on in Fund 2.
Would love to hear some more examples. You've already been highlighting a couple of companies that help make it tangible. There were a couple that caught my eye and would love to create the opportunity for you to also highlight some that maybe you haven't mentioned, although I know it's always hard to pick favorites. Tell me about Crux. And then also, how about Moment Energy? Two companies I think are really interesting and might perhaps reflect something interesting about Overture.
You've picked two of my favorites. And if I can tell you a personal story to start, one of the founders of Crux, Alfred Johnson, the CEO, who happens to be one of the most dynamic CEOs I've ever worked with. He's a very, very close personal friend, someone that I have a friendship with dating back to 2008. He was on the Obama campaign, worked in the Obama White House with me. He's a Stanford undergrad, happened to actually be a football player at Stanford. He's like 6'5" and a giant, and played at Stanford and later went to Stanford Business School. And he started a political technology startup actually in the wake of Trump that I was fortunate enough to be the first investor in, called Mobilize. If anyone on this call is taking any action in the Democratic Party, it is all happening on Mobilize. You'll notice that as you start taking those actions. Alfred built that company, sold that company to an insight-backed, scaled, mature company for a great exit for our investors and for Alfred personally, but more importantly, built a huge corner of the democratic infrastructure ecosystem that is still relied on today. And that friendship with Alfred bled over into climate. We both ended up in climate, and Alfred started this company, Crux Climate, which is a software marketplace for all of the tax credits associated with wind and solar and geothermal and hydrogen credits that can now be transferable for the first time. So in the old regime before the IRA, if you were building a solar plant, you'd have to invite tax equity to pretend to invest in your project to then get these tax credits out. And that was actually slowing down the pace of deployment of renewables. And so the IRA changed those rules to allow a developer to just sell the credit right away to someone that wanted to buy the credit. And so that requires the need for a software marketplace to connect buyers and sellers, which is what Crux does. And with dizzying scale and success, Crux has unlocked billions of dollars of transactions of credits in a very short period of time. Lower Carbon led the seed, and Andreessen Horowitz then came in to lead the Series A with a host of really prominent energy developers like LS Power and Ørsted, who are now on the cap table as well. So Crux is a very personal story for me. We're really proud to be first money into that company. You asked about Moment Energy, which is an equally dynamic team led by a CEO named Eddie. This team is really a software company that has invented a battery management software that can dynamically rebalance power at the cell level in packs. And what that means practically is you can take a used EV battery pack and ensure that if one cell is degraded, it doesn't hold the whole pack hostage. And similarly, if one pack is lower performing, it won't hold a whole system hostage. And what that allows for is used EV packs can come out of the EVs and still have plenty of life as second life stationary storage for on-grid or behind-the-meter purposes. In a power-constrained world where we're going to have a lot of price volatility in electricity, a lot of these commercial and industrial players now want a lot of storage to give them flexibility. at times when power is scarce and prices are high. And as a result, these guys can deliver a used EV pack that performs like new at one half the price of a new lithium ion pack. And that's a dramatic savings and a dramatic import to these C&I customers who are really hungry for storage. And so if they can continue to refine this BMS, they can even apply it to new packs such that if LG is shipping a new pack, they're not worried about one cell being faulty and therefore needing to replace the whole pack. It's really a software company that is doing some hardware and really innovating quickly. They are about to announce a new round of financing from a top tier fund, and we're really excited to support the company.
Who else? I'm sure there's tons of companies that you'd like to brag about, but anyone else that's a reflection of what's unique about Overture?
Sure. Just to pull this thread on the personal nature of working with founders, another very old friend of mine named Jocelyn Lai is the CEO of a company called Bedrock Energy. Bedrock is a geothermal heating and cooling company that has invented a rig that can drill 1,500 feet subsurface in urban environments to be able to unlock geothermal heating and cooling of huge buildings. Think commercial buildings with thousands and thousands of square feet. Those cannot be heated or cooled with air source heat pumps because it would actually be a higher OpEx bill and would also strain the grid with that much more power. And so in a load constrained environment, the ability to use ground source heat pumps is hyper efficient. You punch those holes in the ground and you can heat and cool buildings for hundreds of years because the temperature differential is so reliable between subsurface and surface. In the winter, it is warmer under the surface. You can pull that temperature up to be able to warm the building. And the inverse is true in the summer. This company has invented a geothermal rig that can fit in a truck and just work in urban environments. And so for the first time, things like Amazon fulfillment centers and data centers and office buildings can be heated and cooled with this technology. It's no surprise that Amazon came in as a customer, as has AT&T and CIM, the largest asset owner in America. That company, Bedrock, we were able to originate. We actually helped introduce the CEO and the CTO, and they built this business. Wireframe led the seed round. Prominent fund will be announcing a financing here shortly as well for this company, Bedrock. The startup journey is so fraught with risk, Jason. It's so fun to be able to invest in people you know and care about and respect and work with them for decades. Venture is so risky and sometimes can feel like such an awful asset class that to be able to build meaningful relationships and be able to dent decarbonization and, in the best cases, have billion-dollar outcomes in some cases, which we hope to have in our portfolio, that can be a really rewarding trifecta.
Shomik, you've had a front row seat to how government can support the climate transition and the innovation we need. We have a big election coming up, and actually this episode will launch exactly 1 week before the election. So need to ask, from a climate tech perspective, what do you feel is at stake and what should folks be doing?
I'm sheepish because every 4 years we say this is the most important election of our lifetime. And we said it in 2016 and meant it. We said it in 2020 and meant it. And it can feel hollow if you hear the same thing over and again like a town crier. But I really think this is the opportunity to strike the final blow to end a lot of the autocratic sort of tendency in the MAGA movement right now. The Republican Party will be practical. It will have to restructure itself if it loses 2 presidential elections in a row with this strategy. So my plea to everyone is that politics is not a spectator sport. It is not a thing that we observe and hope for the best. It is a stimulus sensitive operation. And so there's so much agency, especially for something called relational organizing. There is an app called Reach that the Democratic Party uses that will find your friends, Jason, your personal contacts in your phone who are registered voters in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, North Carolina, and Nevada. And they will help you contact those people and urge them to vote. That is the single most useful thing you can possibly do. Knocking on doors is amazing. People should do it if they have time. Calling registered voters is amazing. People should do that if they have time. But contacting people you already know who are in your phone book in a low trust environment is the single most high leverage action anyone can take. So I'd really recommend listeners download Reach and they use this in conjunction with the Harris campaign or whatever Democrats you want. The Democratic Party is behind the technology to get in touch with your friends and get them to vote in these battleground states. This will be a razor-thin 20,000 vote margin, and it's basically a couple of state Senate districts that will decide the entire election, which can be daunting, but it can also give people a lot of agency to go find friends in those areas and activate them. You asked what's online for climate. If Republicans control the White House, House, and Senate, they will come for the IRA. And if they repeal the IRA, they will set back our decarbonization journey by at least a decade, if not more. And so we've taken the most historic action imaginable in climate, and it is our responsibility as the beneficiaries of that to go protect it. And protecting it means doing the work and taking the actions and getting in the game.
And aside from defending and implementing the IRA, what else needs to happen over the next 4 years from a policy perspective?
The IRA has been jumped over tall buildings and leaped over tall mountains. We need the rest of the world to do the same. And so I'm really interested in the work that Brian Deese is doing to help our allies think about similar programs. And candidly, the hardest to abate sectors need more help to scale faster. And so I hope that just as in any past emergency, like in World War II, where private industry and governments had to sort of collaborate closely in order to sort of engineer success, I think more of that's going to be required. And yes, we're going to need to make sure market forces sort of do the pull. But again, until these subscale solutions reach the dramatic scale that the fossil fuel industry has been able to benefit from, it is just going to require help from every corner and every pocket of society.
Shomik, thank you much for the work that you're doing and for sharing your perspective with us today.
Jason, you're the man. Keep up the good work. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.